Support the Democratic Party. This might sound counterintuitive at first, not the way Americans have been taught to think about politics or the way the media usually portrays things, but there's not that much difference. Despite intense rhetoric, there's not really, and political fighting, there's really not that much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans when you get down to it. Two parties are not that far apart. They agree on essentials. The Democrats support the gargantuan military budget. The U.S. in 2019, it's $700 billion, approaching $1 trillion, which is more than the next 7 countries. In a country where people start GoFundMe pages to basically beg money for life-saving medical procedures, and people actually die. It's been well documented. People die because they can't afford insulin, in what's supposed to be the richest country in the world, and I think this is insane. Now, just some examples. Just enough Democrats voted to support the Patriot Act, which was first passed in 2001 under the Bush administration. This Patriot Act diminishes civil liberties, violates the Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure without a warrant. It's complicated. There are different versions of the Patriot Act since then. They're all bad. Obama has signed a version himself. And examples from the Obama administration, there's been a dramatic diminishment of civil liberties under Obama. First, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. This legislation permitted the U.S. government to indefinitely detain people who are, quote, part of or substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces engaged in hostilities against the United States. That is, the NDAA arms the U.S. military with the ability to imprison indefinitely journalists, activists, and human rights workers based on vague allegations. And this is, if you get down to it, it's pretty sinister. It's really sinister. Essentially, they can arrest anybody they want on vague suspicions. And a group of people, including the journalist Chris Hedges, Chris Hedges sued the Obama administration, and the lawsuit was eventually thrown out. And the ACLU website, it talks about this. The statute contains a sweeping worldwide indefinite detention provision. And when Obama signed it, he issued a signing statement saying he had serious reservations about the provisions, but the statement restricts the way it can be applied, but the statement only applies to how his administration would use the powers granted by the NDAA, and would not affect at all how the law is interpreted by subsequent administrations. And the website ACLU goes on to say, President Obama's action today is a blight on his legacy because he will be forever known as the president who signed indefinite detention without charge or trial into law. And Anthony D. Romero, the ACLU executive director. The statute is particularly dangerous because it has no temporal or geographic limitations and can be used by this and future presidents to militarily detain people captured far from any battlefield. And the ACLU believes that any military detention of American citizens or others within the United States is unconstitutional and illegal, including under the NDAA. In addition, the breadth of the NDAA's detention authority violates international law because it is not limited to people captured in the context of an actual armed conflict, as required by the laws of war. The bill also contains provisions making it difficult to transfer suspects out of military detention. And it also restricts the transfer of cleared detainees from the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay to foreign countries for resettlement or repatriation, making it more difficult to close Guantanamo, as Obama promised to do in his first administration, but he never did. The authorization to use military force, AUMF. So it was passed under the Bush administration. It's a broad and controversial 2001 law. It played a major role in the legal decision to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, the former al-Qaeda propagandist and U.S. citizen, in 2011, according to a redacted memorandum made public. Now, the AUMF was passed under the Bush administration. Everyone voted for it, Democrats and Republicans, except Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California. Everyone voted for it. Barbara Lee has consistently criticized it for basically giving the government a blank check, giving the government unlimited powers to wage war without debate. Basically, yes, the AUMF is an open-ended declaration of war. It overrides the War Powers Act, overrides the war power right to the constitutional provision of the Congress to prerogative of Congress to wage war. And it's actually been used under the Obama administration to allow military action in Afghanistan, the Philippines, Georgia, Yemen, Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Iraq, and Somalia. And the U.S. has been in a constant state of war since then. So we believe AUMF's authority to use lethal force abroad also may apply in inappropriate circumstances. We believe that the AUMF's authority to use lethal force abroad may apply in appropriate circumstances to a United States citizen who is part of the forces of an enemy authorization within the scope of this force authorization. Reads the Justice Department memorandum that went along with it, written by for Attorney General Eric Holder on July 2010, and ostensibly intended only for Al-Awlaki's case. The AUMF is unbounded by geographic or time limitations, indicating the wide berth the Obama administration provides for understanding its powers for the potential targeting of U.S. citizens. The administration's official policy is that the AUMF ought to be ultimately repealed, as Obama said in May. The administration does not support immediate repeal, which already faces a difficult congressional role, which shows that Obama tried to play both sides, basically pretended to be a liberal and was agonizing over it, but ultimately signed it. And it's difficult to repeal. It's not going to happen. So al-Awlaki became the first U.S. citizen to be targeted and killed by a U.S. strike without the rights of due process. Now, Obama ordered the drone strike in 2010 against him. His son, who is a 16-year-old U.S. citizen, was killed 2 weeks later in a U.S. drone strike. He was eating at a restaurant in Yemen. And in January 2017, al-Awlaki's 8-year-old daughter was killed in a U.S. commando attack in Yemen that was ordered by Trump. Now, al-Awlaki is probably not a nice guy. He's an Al-Qaeda propagandist and possibly a planner of 9/11. But human rights groups question why al-Awlaki was killed by the U.S. in a country with which the U.S. was not at war. Again, the ACLU stated, if the government is going to be firing Predator missiles at American citizens, surely the American public has a right to know who's being targeted and why. So, this very dangerous direction we're going in. The AUMF, again, is an open-ended declaration of war against anyone, and the NDAA gives the government the right to target and kill any U.S. citizen under suspicion of terrorist activity. Furthermore, during the Iraq War, there were widespread allegations of torture, human rights abuses by the U.S. in what was an illegal war anyway, under false pretenses. In 2009, Obama effectively formalized full-scale immunity for all government officials who were involved in even the most heinous and lethal torture. And there were actually over 100 cases from the Bush era of CIA people who were engaged in torture. And Obama said, nothing will be gained by spending our time and energy laying blame for the past. We must resist the forces that divide us, and instead come together on behalf of our common future. Yeah, sure, it's fine to forgive mistakes which were made in a foreign country to other people, and of course this leaves the door wide open to future abuses. There we go. Glenn Greenwald mentions in a 2012 Guardian article that Eric Holder's decision to close without charge 2 cases connected to the CIA torture program, 2 people who were tortured to death, one in Kabul, Afghanistan, another in Guantanamo Bay. These were really horrible cases, and Eric Holder decided not to press charges. Greenwald said this eliminates the last possibility that any criminal charges will be brought as a result of the brutal interrogations carried out by the CIA. And as Greenwald says, in sum, the Obama administration has been desperate to ensure that there will be no accountability or even that meaningful investigations ever take place. This is almost certainly due to the fact that members of administration were complicit in these crimes, notably Robert Gates, former CIA director, and it's essentially giving a blank check to the CIA. And so we have Trump appointed Gina Haspel, who was directly involved in torture herself. She's the torture queen, as now director of the CIA. Probably it doesn't really matter because the CIA is drenched in blood anyway, so it doesn't actually matter that much. But still, Gina Haspel should have been prosecuted. Story from an interview: Jimmy Dore, political comedian Jimmy Dore, did with John Kiriakou, CIA whistleblower, and Nancy Pelosi moved not to impeach Bush. She had the famous impeachment is off the table. In the midterm elections, she became Speaker of the House. Because she herself was complicit in the use of torture. She was told about it in 2002, and I'm sure other Democratic leaders were, saying it basically. Jimmy Dore said the famous George Carlin slogan, "It's a big club and you're not in it." Now, the upshot after Obama's actions, presidents now have the power to order drone strikes on U.S. citizens abroad without charges or trial, gather millions of Americans' email and phone records with minimum judicial oversight, and radically redefine what does and does not constitute torture, without fear of ever being prosecuted for war crimes. And I remember I used to watch on 2014, I used to watch the CBS Evening News. I long since stopped, and they had this propaganda narrative. There are allegations of Chinese industrial espionage against the U.S., against high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, and so on. These allegations, and every week they had a drumbeat of it, more and more allegations. And now, I have no doubt the Chinese were and are massively conducting industrial espionage. I have no doubt. All countries do this. The U.S., I'm sure, no doubt the U.S. does it as well. All countries do this. And interestingly, the U.S. got much of its technology in the 19th century from essentially the same way. The U.S. didn't really have a copyright law until the 1890s. So it's a bit hypocritical. It just wants to... Anyway, so they were using this... I don't know anyone in Silicon Valley. Those companies wouldn't hire me anyway. What do I care if the Chinese steal their intellectual property rights? I really have no reason to care. Okay, so anyway, this was going on for a while, and every week, in fact, they were close to, CBS News was going to have this, it was leading up to this major dramatic expose of a single building in Shanghai where they thought the Chinese were conducting this espionage from. This dramatic expose CBS News was going to have. And then the Ed Snowden revelations cut across that. He basically exposed the fact that the government, the NSA, is literally spying on the entire population. They have literally every electronic communication whatsoever in their storage, in a series of bombshell revelations. It's totally cut across the media's propaganda narrative. And the NSA, it is known, the NSA Utah Data Center, which was completed in 2014, at a cost of $1.5 billion. And construction started under Bush, but there's evidence this was ramped up under Obama. Okay, the NSA spying goes way back, way back. It began, electronic surveillance probably began or was ramped up under Bush, but it was evidence it kept going under Obama and seemed to be massively expanded. And the only way we knew about it was from Ed Snowden. And he's in Russia now. He could be prosecuted, probably put in jail for the rest of his life. I say this is definitely an impeachable offense. But okay, so and Eric Holder, interestingly, the Attorney General, Obama's Attorney General, didn't send a single banker to jail after widespread revulsion. He actually returned to his Wall Street Link law firm, And however, he had record prosecutions of leakers and whistleblowers. Uh, Basically, the Obama administration prosecuted John Kiriakou, who was John Kiriakou, CIA operative. He was upset about CIA torture. He had really moral qualms about it. He went through channels and nothing happened. Finally, he went public in an interview and he was prosecuted and he got 2 years in jail. And there's so many other cases. An Al Jazeera interview, Kiriakou said that classified information is leaked basically every day in Washington. It happens all the time. The White House and the Pentagon and the CIA leak constantly. But Kiriakou says, I was prosecuted because I made the CIA look bad. Basically, I aired the CIA's dirty laundry. President Obama was obsessed with leaks more than any other president in history, except maybe Richard Nixon. The CIA knew they had a friend in Obama. In the past, the CIA would either ignore leaks or work behind the scenes to plug them. But they wanted to make an example of me because I called them criminals, and he discussed CIA torture in an interview after going through channels. So under Obama, the highest number of people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and during the Obama administration brought charges under the Espionage Act against 8 people accused of talking to the media. They were Thomas Drake, Shammai Leibowitz, Stephen King, Chelsea Manning, David Shackleben, Jeffrey Sterling, John Kiriakou, and Edward Snowden. So Obama was elected in the belief that he was anti-war. He made a great speech at the DNC Democratic National Convention, which nominated Kerry, who was actually not an anti-war candidate. I have an interesting story about John Kerry. I was living in the Boston area at that time, and I think it was 2003, probably late 2003. John Kerry was coming to Boston area, Manchester, New Hampshire. He was making a speech. And I had a friend of mine who I was hanging out with who was kind of close to the Democratic Party. She was very enthusiastic. She did volunteer work for them. So the Boston Democratic Party was sending these buses to Manchester, New Hampshire to see John Kerry speak. You'd get on a bus. It was totally free. You'd hear him speak and then take a bus back home. Okay, so I took a bus from to Manchester, New Hampshire. It was about an hour, a little over an hour from Boston. And the speech, first of all, the speech was very high. Going into the speech, John Kerry spoke in this big outdoor amphitheater. I think it was the Manchester Civic Center. And very high security. This was a couple of years after 9/11, and people were uptight about terrorism. But I think it was also part of the reason for the high security was to make sure no one brought in anti-war posters. Like the slogan was, "We must be united." That is, code word, the Democratic Party slogan, "Must be united," which really meant that no anti-war sentiment. The slogan was anybody but Bush, and just let's get rid of Bush. We got to stay united, get rid of Bush. Doesn't matter that John Kerry is not an anti-war candidate. Okay, so his speech was bizarre. It was a long, rambling, tried to be folksy speech about how much he liked the Red Sox. And he went down, he used to go down with his uncle to Sox games and really rambling, like, what the hell is this? There's terrorism, major terrorist action a couple of years ago. There's a war in Iraq going really bad, war in Afghanistan. Like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And anyway, okay, the speech was over. We went over to where the buses were supposed to be, and half the buses didn't show up. That's right, half the buses didn't show up. A friend of mine said, "What do we do?" I just said, "Let's get on a bus, any bus." So they were like, I think probably about 6, well, I'd say about 8 buses, and 4 of them didn't show up. So my friend and I just got on a bus, but half the people we got there were stranded in Manchester, New Hampshire, and they were like pissed. It just shows the incompetence of the local Democratic Party. And of course, a friend of mine who I worked with at the time, who got me interested in Trotskyist politics, he predicted Bush would win, because John Kerry was Bush light. Why vote for Bush light if you can vote for the real thing? I mean, any political contest, the most extreme side usually wins. John Kerry was trying to be militaristic and but predictable, he couldn't do it as well as the original. So, okay, where are we here? Yeah, so there was a taste of betrayal of how the Democrats are going to betray their supporters. It happened in the 2006 congressional midterms, which handed Congress back to the Democrats, after 12 years of Republican rule. There was widespread revulsion at the Iraq War and the disaster Bush got the U.S. into. And that year, 73% of Americans wanted withdrawal from Iraq. So after the Democrats got control of the House, they began redefining what withdrawal meant. Well, we can't withdraw right now. We got to do this and do that. And a year later, they voted for $120 million in continued war funding, in spite of the opposition, in spite of what their constituents felt, what their constituents elected them for. Black Agenda Reports, a great website. It's the African American left, and really criticize the Democratic Party and liberals from the left. So they have a book review of a book called Obama, the Greatest War President by Jerry Kuzmarov, Clarity Press, August 2019. It highlights, in some ways, just how horrific Obama has been. First, it describes that while George Bush founded the U.S. AFRICOM, the United States African Command, in 2007, it was Obama who set about implementing military and economic domination over African governments and lands. Stem from competition with China, who then had a huge presence in Africa. And Obama, quote, the quote, drone president, stood for 7 aggressive wars at once, more than any other U.S. president. And according to Kuzmarov, he goes on to say, in my view, Obama, was the worst president in U.S. history because he hypocritically offered hope to the downtrodden, the discriminated against, and the general working population, all the while doing the rich white man's dirty deeds. He beguiled these folks, and he could get away with it, namely because he had black skin and a Harvard voice, which he used to cheat people of all colors and persuasions, all colors and nations. Like Kennedy, Obama provided a liberal front for policies that exacerbated internal inequalities and set back movements for progressive change, keeping us locked in the Cold War and setting the basis for a new Cold War. Kuzmarov goes on to point out that the ramping up of police training and other alleged security measures had a, quote, disturbingly negative impact on public safety, human rights, democratic institutions. So Obama convinced 53 of 54 African nations to accept basically militarization for neo-colonial profiteering. Obama's agricultural policy promoted genetic engineering and chemical-intensive agriculture at the urging of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, DuPont, and Monsanto, whose former executives served in his administration. The war in Yemen began under Obama. It's horrible, turned into horrific, borderline genocide. Obama actually made $1 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, provide diplomatic cover for the horrible things they were doing. And recently there's an issue where former Obama administration officials were scolding Trump, and they admit, well, we got it wrong, but they're scolding Trump for the same thing. So I'm hypocritical there. Okay, there's a book review on Goodreads site saying that from a different book, which I'll talk about, saying Obama was big on lots of empty progressive rhetoric, cloaking a die-hard, sold-out centrist. Who knew his foreign policy would be hawkish? Obama actually said, quote, I have enormous sympathy for the foreign policy of George H.W. Bush. I don't have a lot of regrets about their handling of Desert Storm. He actually said this. So the writer goes on to say, so Obama has enormous sympathy for those who commit war crimes, including the sadistic Highway of Death massacre. There were actually 10 times more airstrikes under Obama than under Bush, a total of 536 strikes, largely by drones, targeted Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen during Obama's 2 terms, compared to 57 strikes under Bush. Between 384 and 807 civilians were killed in those countries, according to reports. So, on the average, about close to 2,000 civilians were killed, creating massive disruption in those countries. And the use of drones aligned with Obama's ambition to keep up the war against al-Qaeda, while extricating the U.S. military from intractable, costly ground wars in the Middle East and Asia. Also, there's a coup in Honduras, which Hillary Clinton was implicated in, basically a moderate reformer, was in Honduras, was overthrown in favor of pro-oligarch president. There were mass protests, and there was basically a bloodbath in which Berta Cáceres, a prize-winning indigenous environmental activist, was killed, and she's just one of thousands of indigenous activists, peasant leaders, trade unionists, journalists, environmentalists, judges, opposition political opponents, candidates, human rights activists, and others were murdered since a military coup elected the democratically elected president Manuel Zelaya in 2009. And we have no evidence that Obama was directly behind the coup, although this coup is only one of dozens of U.S.-backed, U.S.-supported, U.S.-caused, U.S.-created coups all throughout Latin America, throughout the 20th century alone. And we have no evidence that Obama was directly behind it. I have my suspicions. But we do know that Hillary Clinton and Obama administration officials blocked the return of the elected candidate. There's mid-mass peaceful protests. The U.S. blocked the return of Zelaya. Okay, there's foreign policy, domestic policy. There was, during the two Obama administrations, there was a massive ramp up of police militarization, which began under the Bush administration, but continued under Obama. Spare military equipment was sold or given to police forces, and you've got cases where small town PDs had armored personnel carriers, like what the hell they need this for. But there was a ramping up of militarization of our country. And in 2015, there was an executive order, but Obama had passed an executive order banning the sales of military equipment to the police domestically, but there's evidence it continued anyway. And of course, as I mentioned, the small town PDs with armored personnel carriers, increased use of SWAT teams, evidence of spiraling police brutality, ramped up police repression, and of course, U.S. is becoming a police state, or it is a police state. For people of color, of course, it's always been a police state, but the repression is being ramped up, and now middle-class white people are being targeted. It's more obvious it's a police state than it always was for some people. And a friend asked me, like, what happened in relation to the change in the U.S. police, why they always seem so totally brutal right now. And a socialist friend answered on social media, 2008 happened. Yeah, the ruling class saw the need to ramp up repression after the 2008 financial collapse. So the Occupy movement, a lot of people thought Obama would be a transformative leader, and they waited and waited and waited, and not much happened. He bailed out the bankers and didn't do a lot for ordinary people. And so the Occupy movement came in 2011, and it's open to criticism. It was amorphous, didn't have clear-cut demands, but it showed widespread discontent along wide sections of the population, which is still very much exists, and it did ignite a protest movement or feeling, which is still going on today. Okay, the Occupy movement was actually crushed by Democrats. Most of the big city mayors were Democrats who crushed it. The local police in these cities, what they did, they would herd homeless people or mentally ill people to the Occupy encampments, and deliberately to sabotage them. The Occupy encampments did not have the tools necessary to help people, victimized by capitalism. What could they do? They tried their best, but it helped sabotage them. The movement was crushed by big city mayors, where Democrats and the police sabotaged it. The crushing of the Occupy movement, it was coordinated. It was done in many different cities, but we have evidence it was coordinated from the White House. They had the, quote, Fusion Center. Jean Quan, who was the mayor of Oakland, she's a former Maoist actually, but she'd been working with the Democratic Party and went through a downhill path from there. She spilled the beans. She actually said it was directed from the White House, while Obama himself was safely overseas. He was in Asia for the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, something like that. I didn't want to get the blame for it exactly, but it was directly coordinated from the Obama White House crushing of Occupy. Basically, I think the reason it was behind it being crushed was that the Democrats, as amorphous and as open to criticism as Occupy was, the Democrats feared another rival pole of attraction developing. They did not like that. They hate anything to their left. It represents huge momentum for change in U.S. society, separate from the Democratic Party, and they tried to either co-opt it or totally destroy it. And okay, so another thing the Democratic Party can be criticized for under the Obama era is the Battle of Wisconsin, when right-wing Governor Scott Walker, he introduced very anti-union, introduced bills with tax cuts for businesses, but restriction on public sector workers' rights to strike. It was so-called Act 10, called the Budget Repair Bill, and it effectively destroyed public sector workers' unions. The public sector workers are today throughout the country the largest force, which is still unionized. Unions have really taken it on the chin, largely in the last decade, so largely because of their business unionism. They weren't able to cope. So anyway, this budget repair bill effectively destroying unions. It became a flashpoint. There were mass protests. Hundreds of thousands of people were protesting in Madison, around the State House, and throughout the state of Wisconsin. And there was solidarity with the Arab Spring. There was a time there were mass protests in Egypt, Tahrir Square protest. In fact, there was a case where people in Egypt, in Cairo, were ordering pizzas through the internet, ordering pizzas as a gesture of solidarity to the people in Wisconsin. It was really cool. There's solidarity, and these two movements were riffing off one another. Okay, now there's a booklet, really good booklet, put out by Socialist Alternative, which I'm not a member of. I was at one time. I'm not a member. It describes how people, it's a really good booklet. I recommend reading it. It describes how during this time people on the radical left in Wisconsin called for a general strike, and was taken up by the broader movement. It's really unusual in recent U.S. history. There have been general strikes where everyone in a sector just strikes. It's technically illegal. It's illegal to do it, but people do it. It's been done anyway. And it's happened in Greece, fairly often in Greece and other parts of the world. There's also, the booklet says, this was incredibly significant, the South Central Federation of Labor, SCFL, with delegates representing 97 unions and over 45,000 workers in the greater Madison area, officially endorsed a general strike. It was getting currency, and it could have done something. Now, general strike, it would have started with, say, 1-day general strike, and then broadened from there, a 3-day strike, a week strike, shut down the state. Now, it would cross the lines of legality, which you'd have to do this, really. That's how the original union movement, originally was against a lot of strike. That's how the union movement began in the 19th century, really brutal era. There are many, many laws against workers. You're going to have to push it a little bit. And if everyone does it, they can't enforce the law. They're going to have to back down. So a 1-day strike would embolden workers, would more run out to a 2-day strike, a week strike, shut down the state. I think that's the only thing which would have probably gotten rid of Scott Walker, forced him to back down. However, the idea of a general strike was talked down by the union leadership. Democratic Party aligned unions. Union leaders usually are always more conservative. They try to talk things down. The business union model is really big. They try to work out a deal with the bosses. Basically, they're social class. They have more in common with the bosses than their workers, but they also have to represent workers also. So they talked down this idea of a general strike, the union leadership, and the movement was diverted into a recall election. So basically, it turned to a disaster. As Socialist Alternative says, the class struggle was transformed into an electoral struggle between a corporate Republican and a corporate Democrat. Although I think all Democrats are corporate Democrats. So the Democratic candidate who they put up was the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, was a very uninspiring candidate. He had actually already lost to Scott Walker in 2010, and Barrett himself was anti-union. He tried to distance himself from the movement that made the recall possible. He refused to commit to reversing Act 10, the anti-union law, and so the Democrats, not surprisingly, lost the recall, and the pro-union movement was wrecked. Scott Walker was reelected, and in fact, Scott Walker ran again in 2014, and this time he ran against Democrats put up a former CEO, in predictable disaster. So the Democrats really got defeat from the jaws, or could have been the jaws of victory. Democrats, classic case of Democrats destroying and subverting a workers' movement. Okay, so, and oh, by the way, Obama, people were hoping and expecting Obama to come to Wisconsin during the speech to show solidarity. If Obama had come to Madison, made a speech, it would have been to show support. It would have been electrifying. It would have been, this was a classic case of right-wing Republicans taking away workers' rights. And people were hoping and assumed Obama was a transformative leader. He came out there. If he had come out to Wisconsin, it would have been a game changer. He didn't. He didn't say a word. He refused to express any solidarity with Wisconsin. He totally ignored the movement. He said literally one sentence. Oh, I really support them. I really support the workers, and that's all he said, the workers in Wisconsin. He refused to. So, and there's betrayal right there. So, okay, a WikiLeaks document, part of the massive trove of documents within the Democratic Party, show a massive trove of revelations showing corruption within the Democratic Party around 2016, showed that Obama's cabinet in 2008 was literally picked by Citigroup. Part of this was shown in the Podesta emails. Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, his emails were revealed. So Citigroup gave a Wall Street finance company, and gave Obama a choice among people like Robert Rubin, Timothy Geithner, Lawrence Summers, who was later president of Harvard, on history of sexism, and all Wall Street insiders, and they were often connected with deregulation under Bill Clinton, the Clinton era. And by the way, Obama's chief of staff was Rahm Emanuel. He was a horrible guy. He helped destroy public education in Chicago, attempted to destroy it, major fight back by the unions. And Phil Rockstroh, a poet, calls Obama, quote, President Drone von Citigroup. I think that's really apt, kind of funny and really apt. Okay, an article from the World Socialist website. It's another socialist group, and I don't agree with everything they say, but they do have some good analysis. They talked about Obama, said, then presidential candidate Obama, this is when he was running, in 2008, then presidential candidate Obama played a critical political role in shepherding the massively unpopular bank bailout through Congress. The September financial crash convicted decisive sections of the U.S. corporate financial elite. The Democratic candidate of hope and change would be better positioned to contain popular opposition to the bailout than his Republican rival, Senator John McCain of Arizona. As President Obama not only funneled trillions of dollars to the bank, $700 trillion altogether, to the TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program, he also saw to it that not a single leading Wall Street executive faced prosecution for the orgy of speculation and swindling that led to the financial collapse and Great Recession, and Obama personally intervened to block legislation capping financial pay for bailed out firms. Okay, Obama on the environment was also really bad. He was pro-fracking. He did a few good things. He expanded parks, he expanded federally protected wild lands, things like that. Yes, that's good, but the things that really counted, he was very pro-fracking, strong evidence that Obama sabotaged the climate change. Three made big international climate change conferences, Durban, Copenhagen, so they wouldn't amount to much. Paris Accords, the famous Paris Climate Accords, were signed, and Obama played a role in that, but Obama made sure they were non-binding. Actually, they're meaningless, or not totally meaningless, but they're completely non-binding, and Trump could easily dispense with it. Obama was a big supporter of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been called NAFTA on steroids. It was deeply unpopular. This would have massively increased corporate power and limit people's ability to challenge corporate power, including environmental destruction and workers' rights and things like that. And the TPP was actually written by Hillary Clinton. And so the U.S., compared to other industrial countries around the world, has long been known to have a horrible situation for healthcare. In 2014, there were about 44 million people who had no health care, and I've mentioned that even today, GoFundMe, the fundraising site, is the country's largest healthcare provider, which is a horrible situation. So there was when Obama got in, there was tremendous momentum for some kind of health care, and Obama had a huge amount of political capital. So his Affordable Care Act, what became known as the Obamacare program, first started from a really poor bargaining position when he first introduced it. You bargaining, you start high and you work low. He started low and got even lower. First, he took public option, any type of national health care, off the table right away, and this represented a massive bailout of the insurance industry. Now, in 2018, about 8.5% of the U.S. population, or 27.5 million people, still don't have no health insurance. But the coverage, and so more people are insured compared to back then. Still, a lot of people still aren't, but the coverage people do have has decreased. An article by the Commonwealth Fund of February of this year says that 45% of U.S. adults ages 19 to 64 are inadequately funded, the same as in 2010. Although important shifts have taken place, more people do have some coverage, and the people who do have more people who do have coverage are underinsured now than in 2010, with the greatest increase occurring among those in employer plans. So it's hard to say if there was a gain or not. I've been on Obamacare. It's been horrible. I'm still on it. Everyone I know who's been on it has not had a good experience with it. At one point I had to pay like $400 fine for not being able to afford the insurance, basically. And nobody I know has had a good experience with it. And today, in the situation in 2019, we still have a situation where people die because they can't afford insulin. And insulin can be produced for just a few dollars, but manufacturers like Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk actually mark up the prices 5,000%, and there are now 7 million Americans with diabetes who have no choice but to pay. And this price is so high that people are now doing desperate things to get by, like using expired insulin, relying on crowdfunding to pay their bills, or literally to save their life, or taking less insulin than they need in an effort to ration their supplies. So rationing is extremely dangerous and can lead to a deadly condition known as diabetic ketoacidosis. 3 people have died in 2017 while rationing their insulin. 3 more people died in 2018, and so far 4 died in 2019, as far as we know. This is from a website called RightCare. Now, back to the World Socialist website. It mentions a few interesting things about the Obama era. First, the Obama era, as 2 terms, period was distinguished by 2 major trends. The first 2-term presidency to preside over uninterrupted war for the entire duration, and the greatest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top in American history. Since leaving office, the Obamas have garnered a $65 million book deal, and Obama is making an estimated 50 speeches a year before corporate and Wall Street audiences at about $400,000 a pop. And it's been estimated that the couple is on course to rapidly amass a fortune of $242 million. And outdoing the Clintons, who up to now have managed to cash in only to the tune of $75 million. And in the middle of a speech in South Africa recently honoring the legacy of Nelson Mandela, by the way, the CIA gave away his location, and Obama said, and this is kind of an very odd thing for him to say, in the middle of his speech, Obama said, "I should add, by the way, right now I'm actually surprised by how much money I got. And let me tell you something, I don't have half as much as most of those folks, or a 10th or a 100th. There's only so much you can eat. There's only so big a house you can have. There's only so many nice trips you can take. I mean, it's enough." Like, what the hell? And the Obamas are currently buying a $14 million house on Martha's Vineyard. As a friend of mine said recently, he's well rewarded for bailing out those bankers.